At 6:30 in the morning, Victoria Whitmore walked through my farm gate carrying a folder full of documents and the confidence of someone who believed the decision had already been made. She thought she was arriving at Cedar Ridge Farm to discuss a simple community matter. She did not realize that every paper she carried, every assumption she made, and every step she took that morning would eventually become the reason people questioned her authority. I was standing near the old wooden fence line when I heard tires moving across the gravel road. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists on a rural Montana property. The sun was rising over the fields. A light breeze moved through the grass. The barn my father built more than 40 years earlier stood exactly where it always had. Nothing about that morning felt unusual until I saw the vehicles coming toward my gate. A white SUV led the way. 2 pickup trucks followed behind. The Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association logo was clearly visible on the doors. I stopped and watched them approach. This was not a neighbor dropping by. This was a group arriving with a purpose. Victoria stepped out first. She was dressed like someone walking into a board meeting, not onto a working farm. Behind her came 2 HOA board members and a contractor carrying measuring equipment. Nobody called ahead. Nobody asked whether I was available. Nobody asked whether they had permission to enter the property. They simply walked toward the gate as if the answer had already been decided. "Mr. Caldwell," Victoria called out. I walked over, but stayed on my side of the fence. "Good morning, Victoria. What brings you out here?" She opened the folder immediately. "We are here to conduct a property compliance review." I looked at the people standing behind her. A review of what exactly? She looked down at the tablet in her hand. "Several concerns have been reported regarding the condition of the property, surrounding areas, and access points near the community." I had heard language like that before. Concerns, standards, community impact. Words that sounded harmless until someone used them to justify crossing a line. "Victoria," I said, "this is Cedar Ridge Farm. It is private property." She smiled politely. It was not an angry smile. It was the smile of someone who believed she had already explained enough. "We understand that, Mr. Caldwell. But this property affects the surrounding neighborhood." That sentence told me more than she intended. She was not talking about ownership. She was talking about influence. She believed being nearby gave her a reason to be involved. "Which agreement gives the HOA permission to inspect my land?" I asked. For a moment, she stopped. It was brief. Most people would have missed it. I did not. During my years working investigations, I learned something important. The first answer someone gives is not always the most revealing. Sometimes the pause before the answer tells you more. "The HOA has responsibilities related to maintaining community standards," she replied. I nodded slowly. It was a careful response, but it was not the response I asked for. "Within your community," I said. "Not automatically on my property." One of the board members, Daniel Mercer, looked away. The contractor holding the equipment shifted his position. They had arrived expecting an argument. They had not expected questions. Victoria stepped closer to the gate. "We are trying to work with you, not against you." "Working together usually starts with asking first," I replied, "not arriving with a team." Her expression changed slightly. She looked beyond me toward the farmhouse, the barn, and the fields stretching behind the property. I recognized that look. It was the look people gave when they saw land before they saw the person responsible for it. Cedar Ridge Farm had been in my family for decades. My father built that barn with his own hands. He repaired those fences. He spent countless mornings walking those fields before Silver Pines Estates was ever developed. To Victoria, this was acreage next to a growing neighborhood. To me, it was a place filled with history. She opened the folder again and handed me another document. "We only need temporary access for measurements and photographs." I looked at the paper but did not take it. "No." The answer surprised her. "Not because I raised my voice." I did not. It surprised her because I did not hesitate. She expected resistance. She did not expect certainty. "I think there may be some confusion," she said. "The HOA has a responsibility to protect property values." "I understand that," I answered. "But protecting your property values does not give you control over mine." The silence that followed was longer than anyone expected. Victoria looked back at her board members. They had no immediate response. Finally, she closed the folder. "We will follow up with additional paperwork." I nodded. That would be the appropriate next step. She turned and walked back toward her vehicle. Before leaving, she stopped and looked at the gate one more time. She still believed this was a simple disagreement. She believed more paperwork and more meetings would eventually convince me to cooperate. What she did not understand was that I was not ignoring her. I was paying attention, and every decision she made after that morning would answer a question she never thought anyone would ask. Did the HOA actually have the authority it claimed? 3 weeks later, the same documents Victoria carried through my gate would become the reason everyone started asking a different question. Not why I refused to cooperate, but why she believed she had the right to ask in the first place. Victoria Whitmore did not return to Cedar Ridge Farm after that morning. Instead, 3 days later, a large envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a formal notice from Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association. The approach had changed. There were no vehicles parked outside my gate. No contractor waiting with equipment. No group standing there expecting immediate access. This time, everything came through paperwork. I carried the envelope inside and placed it on the same kitchen table my father built years earlier. It was the table where he used to spread out farm maps, repair notes, and property records after long days working outside. He always believed that details mattered. He used to say that most problems begin when people stop paying attention to the small things. I thought about that while reading Victoria's notice. The document was filled with official language. It mentioned community concerns. It mentioned surrounding property values. It mentioned cooperation and future discussions. Every sentence sounded reasonable. That was what made it interesting. The strongest assumptions are often hidden inside words that sound harmless. But when I finished reading, I noticed something important. The document never answered the one question that mattered most. What gave the HOA authority over Cedar Ridge Farm? The answer was missing. I placed the notice beside the document Victoria had brought to my gate. Different wording. Same assumption. They believed that because they wanted something to happen, they had a path to make it happen. Those two things are not the same. Wanting access is not the same as having access. Discussing a possibility is not the same as creating a right. That afternoon, I called Daniel Mercer. He answered quickly. "Ethan, I was wondering if you received the notice." "I did," I said. There was a brief pause. "Victoria believes this can still be resolved." I looked out the window toward the fields. "Resolved how?" Daniel hesitated. It was a small moment, but I noticed it. "She wants another conversation." "About what?" "The concerns." I leaned back in my chair. "Daniel, everyone keeps using that word. Concerns. But nobody has explained who actually has the authority to make decisions about my property." He did not respond immediately. That silence told me something. The first morning at the gate, Daniel had stood behind Victoria. Now he sounded like someone trying to understand what he had supported. "I am not refusing to talk," I continued. "But before anyone discusses changes involving Cedar Ridge Farm, they need to understand where their authority ends." After the call, I opened the cabinet where I kept my property records. I pulled out the deed, the surveys, and the county maps. Everything was exactly where it had always been. Cedar Ridge Farm was not part of Silver Pines Estates. The boundary lines were clear. The ownership records were clear. There was no confusion. But while reviewing the newer documents, I noticed something else. References to possible improvements near the southern edge of my land. Notes about future connections. Mentions of access routes. Nothing official. Nothing approved. Just ideas written down years earlier. That was when I became more interested. Ideas are harmless when they remain ideas. The problem begins when people start treating them like commitments. The next morning, I drove into town and stopped at the county records office. It was a small building where most people knew each other. The clerk recognized me and asked what I was looking into. I told her I wanted to review development records connected to Silver Pines Estates. For the next several hours, I went through old files. Most of them were routine. Construction approvals, road planning documents, utility records. Nothing unusual. Then I found it. A reference to a possible access route near Cedar Ridge Farm. I read the page carefully. Then I read it again. It was not an easement. It was not a transfer of property rights. It was not permission. It was a discussion. Someone had written down a possibility years ago. Somewhere along the way, that possibility had started changing into something people treated like a fact. I printed the document and continued searching. The pattern became clearer with every page. Silver Pines wanted a connection near my property. That was not surprising. Communities grow. People make plans. Developers look toward the future. Wanting something was not the issue. The issue was what happened after that. At some point, someone stopped asking, "Can this happen?" and started saying, "This is what will happen." I closed the file and looked at the date on the document. It was older than Victoria's first visit. Much older. That changed my understanding of the situation. Victoria had not created this idea. She had inherited it. She stepped into a plan that had been sitting quietly for years, waiting for someone confident enough to move it forward. And now I needed to find out exactly how an unfinished conversation became something the HOA believed it could enforce. The county records office became my first stop every morning after that. I would arrive with a cup of coffee, sit at the same desk near the back window, and continue reviewing the history of Silver Pines Estates. To most people, those files would have looked like ordinary paperwork. Old maps, planning notes, development records, pages filled with dates and signatures. But I had spent enough years working investigations to know that documents rarely tell their full story at first glance. The important details are usually hidden in the small things people overlook. A missing signature, a sentence that changes meaning, a conversation that never became an agreement. I started building a timeline, the original development plans, the first discussions about expansion, the references to possible access points. Then I compared those records with everything Victoria Whitmore had said since arriving at my gate. The pattern became clearer with every page. Victoria was not creating a new idea. She was continuing one that had existed for years. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. A possibility became an expectation. An expectation became a plan. And eventually, that plan was being treated like something the HOA already had the right to pursue. That was the part that concerned me, not the idea itself. Communities make plans all the time. They discuss improvements. They consider future possibilities. That is normal. The problem begins when people skip the step where they ask who has the authority to make those possibilities real. That afternoon, I returned home and spread the documents across my kitchen table. The farmhouse was quiet. Outside the window, the southern edge of Cedar Ridge Farm stretched toward the area mentioned in the old records. I looked toward the barn my father built and remembered something he always believed. A strong foundation is usually the part nobody notices. He was talking about buildings when he said it, but the same idea applies to everything else. Trust, ownership, decisions. If the foundation is weak, everything built on top of it eventually shows the cracks. The next morning, Victoria requested another meeting. This time, she wanted to meet away from the farm, somewhere neutral. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop in town. Daniel Mercer came with her. He looked different from the first morning at my gate. He was still respectful, but the certainty was gone. Victoria arrived carrying the same folder. She placed it on the table before she even sat down. "Ethan, I want you to understand that the HOA is trying to find a solution that works for everyone." I nodded. I understand wanting a solution. What I do not understand is why the solution involves my property. She opened the folder and pulled out a map. There are opportunities to improve connections in this area. She pointed toward the southern boundary of Cedar Ridge Farm, the same area mentioned in the old planning documents. "Who approved this route?" I asked. She looked surprised. "Approved? Yes. Who gave permission to plan around my land?" For a moment, she looked toward Daniel. It was brief, but it was enough. Daniel noticed it too. "We are exploring options," Victoria said. I looked at the map. Exploring options is fine, but exploring options does not create property rights. Daniel shifted in his chair. "Victoria, I thought this was still just a possibility." She looked at him. "It is a possibility that could benefit the entire community." That answer explained more than she realized. Victoria was focused on what she believed the community could gain. I was focused on the process required to make something legitimate. Those two things were not the same. "Victoria," I said, "there is nothing wrong with discussing future ideas. The problem starts when people begin acting like those ideas already belong to them." She closed the folder slowly. "Sometimes communities require compromise." I nodded. "That is true. But compromise requires both sides to have a choice." The conversation ended shortly afterward. Victoria gathered her papers and left. Daniel stayed behind for a moment. He looked uncomfortable. "I did not realize how far this had gone," he admitted. I looked through the coffee shop window at people walking down the street. Most people do not realize how far something has gone until they look back at the steps that created it. On the drive home, I thought about everything I had learned. Victoria believed she was dealing with a property owner who simply needed more convincing. She did not understand that I was not trying to win an argument. I was trying to understand how an assumption became a plan. And the more I followed the timeline, the more one thing became obvious. This situation did not begin when Victoria arrived at my gate. It began years earlier, when someone wrote down an idea and nobody stopped to ask whether that idea ever became a right. The more I reviewed the documents, the more I realized this situation was not about one disagreement at my gate. It was about a chain of assumptions that had been building for years. Victoria Whitmore had stepped into a plan that existed long before she became president of Silver Pines Estates. The road discussions, the possible connection, the future development ideas, they were all pieces of something that had never actually been completed. But somehow, those unfinished conversations had become something people treated as if they were already approved. That was the part that mattered. An idea is not the same as an agreement. A conversation is not the same as permission. And a possibility is not the same as a property right. During my years working investigations, I learned that most problems do not begin with one major mistake. They begin with small assumptions that nobody challenges. Someone believes something is true. Someone else repeats it. Eventually, enough people accept it that nobody remembers to ask where it started. That was exactly what happened with Cedar Ridge Farm. A possibility became an expectation. An expectation became a plan. And a plan became something people believed they could move forward with. A few days after my meeting with Victoria and Daniel, another letter arrived from Silver Pines Estates. I opened it at my kitchen table and read it carefully. The wording was different from the previous notices. It was more cautious, more polished. It talked about future coordination and community planning discussions. Those phrases were carefully chosen. Victoria was no longer saying the HOA already had the ability to access my property. Instead, she was creating the impression that agreement was simply the next step in a process that had already started. That told me something important. She knew the details were not as simple as she wanted everyone to believe. That afternoon, I called Clara Bennett. She had been helping me review the documents, and she understood the importance of separating facts from assumptions. We met in my farmhouse office while rain tapped against the windows. Clara placed the paperwork across my desk and organized everything by date. "Ethan," she said, "I think we finally have the complete picture." "What do you see?" I asked. She picked up the oldest planning document. This was the beginning. Years ago, someone discussed creating a possible access connection near your property. I nodded. "But it never happened." "Correct," she said. "There is no recorded easement. No signed agreement. No transfer of rights. Nothing that gives the HOA authority over Cedar Ridge Farm." I looked back at the document in front of me. "So the entire plan is based on something unfinished." Clara nodded. "Exactly. They are treating an unfinished discussion like a completed agreement." That was the key point. The old discussions were real. Victoria was not wrong about that. But she was ignoring the most important part. Those discussions never became a legal right. Clara continued reviewing the documents. Then she pulled out several printed emails. "Look at these dates." I followed the timeline. The conversations between HOA members and outside contractors started months before Victoria ever arrived at my gate. They had already discussed possible improvements. They had already considered costs. They had already talked about how the area could change. But one person was missing from every conversation. The owner of the property they were discussing. Me. I sat quietly for a moment and looked through the window toward the fields. Cedar Ridge Farm had not changed. The barn was still standing. The fences were still where my family had built them. The gravel road was still the same road my father had maintained for decades. The only thing that changed was that other people had started imagining a future for land they did not own. That evening, Daniel called me. His voice sounded different from before, less certain, more concerned. "Ethan, I think there is something you should know." "What is it?" I asked. "Victoria has been speaking with contractors for months." I looked at the documents spread across my desk. "About my property?" "Yes." I waited for him to continue. "Did she tell them there was no agreement?" There was a long pause. That pause answered the question before he did. "I do not think everyone understood that," he finally said. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I added the information to the timeline. The first visit, the notices, the meetings, the contractor discussions, everything connected. Victoria was not waiting to see if permission existed. She was moving as if permission was simply something that would come later. That was when I realized the situation had moved beyond a simple misunderstanding. The real question was no longer whether Victoria wanted access to Cedar Ridge Farm. That part was obvious. The real question was how many people had already accepted her version of events without ever checking whether it was true. And I knew the next HOA meeting would reveal exactly how far that assumption had spread. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the Silver Pines Clubhouse. Victoria Whitmore called it a community discussion, but by then I had learned something important. The name of a meeting does not always reveal the purpose behind it. Sometimes the most important information is found in what people choose not to mention. Before leaving for the clubhouse, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the timeline one more time. The first visit to my gate, the inspection request, the official notices, the contractor conversations, the old planning documents. Every detail connected to the next. I was not preparing for an argument. I was not looking for a way to embarrass Victoria. I simply wanted everyone involved to see the same facts. The clubhouse parking lot was already crowded when I arrived. Residents stood outside in small groups, talking quietly before the meeting started. The atmosphere was different from the first time Victoria presented her ideas. People were no longer just waiting to hear what the HOA planned to do. They were asking questions before they even entered the building. That was usually the first sign that people were beginning to look deeper. Daniel Mercer walked over as I approached the entrance. "Ethan," he said, "tonight is going to be different." I looked around at the residents. "Why?" He glanced toward the crowd. "Because people are asking for details now." I nodded. "That changes the conversation." Inside the clubhouse, Victoria stood near the front of the room with her laptop open and several maps ready. She looked prepared. She looked confident. She looked exactly like the person who had arrived at my gate weeks earlier. The difference was that this time, more people were paying attention to the spaces between her words. The meeting began with Victoria explaining the future plans for Silver Pines Estates. She talked about growth. She talked about convenience. She talked about creating better connections throughout the community. Everything sounded reasonable. That was why people had listened to her at first. Most residents want their neighborhood to improve. Most people appreciate leaders who think ahead. But planning for the future still requires respect for the rights of the people affected by those plans. After several minutes, Victoria displayed a map showing the proposed route near Cedar Ridge Farm. Several residents leaned forward and studied it more carefully. A homeowner near the front raised his hand. "Victoria, I have a question." She smiled. "Of course. Has Mr. Caldwell approved this plan?" The room became quiet. Victoria looked toward the screen for a moment. Then she looked back at the residents. "We are working toward an agreement." It was a careful answer, but everyone understood what it meant. There was no agreement. Another resident spoke. "So the HOA does not have written approval at this time?" Victoria adjusted the papers in front of her. "We are discussing a solution that benefits everyone." Again, she avoided the exact question. I watched the room change. People were beginning to recognize the difference between discussing something and having the authority to do it. Finally, Victoria looked toward me. "Ethan, perhaps you would like to explain your concerns." I stood and walked toward the front table with my folder. I did not bring a presentation. I did not need one. "I do not think this is about concerns anymore," I said. "I think this is about making sure everyone has the same information." I placed the first document on the table. "This is the recorded boundary of Cedar Ridge Farm." I placed the second document beside it. "This is the original development agreement for Silver Pines Estates." Then I placed the final page down. "And this is the old access discussion that started years ago." It was discussed. It was considered, but it was never completed. The room stayed quiet. Victoria looked at the documents carefully. "Those records do not change the fact that cooperation would benefit the entire community." I looked at her. "I agree that cooperation matters. But cooperation requires both sides to have a choice. It cannot begin after one side has already planned the outcome." Several residents nodded. Not because they were taking my side. Because they were finally understanding the difference between an idea and a right. Clara Bennett stood from her seat near the back of the room. Victoria noticed her immediately. She had not expected another person to speak. Clara calmly introduced herself and explained that she had reviewed the records and the timeline. She did not accuse Victoria. She did not raise her voice. She simply explained the difference between a proposal and a legal property right. The documents spoke for themselves. A resident near the side of the room raised a question. "Ethan, can I ask something?" How did you know which information to collect? I looked around the room. For years, most people in Silver Pines knew me only as the owner of Cedar Ridge Farm. They knew I worked the land. They knew I preferred a quiet life. They did not know much about the years before I returned home. Before I came back to Montana, I said, I spent 27 years as an FBI agent. The room went completely silent. Victoria looked at me differently. Not because my background changed the facts. It did not. The property records were still the property records. The boundaries were still the boundaries. But she finally understood why I had never reacted the way she expected. I was not ignoring her. I was not refusing because I was stubborn. I was doing what I had spent years learning to do. Pay attention. Verify information. Follow the facts. And while Victoria believed she was building support for her plan, she had unknowingly created the exact timeline that would show everyone why the plan never had the foundation she believed it did. The room stayed quiet after I mentioned my previous career. It was not the kind of silence that came from fear or intimidation. It was the silence people have when they begin looking back at everything that happened and realize they may have missed something important. I looked around the clubhouse and saw the same reaction on many faces. People were not suddenly convinced because I had worked for the FBI. That was never the reason I shared it. My career did not give me more rights over Cedar Ridge Farm. It did not change the property records. It did not make my position stronger than anyone else's. The documents did that. The law did that. The facts did that. My background only explained why I approached the situation differently from the beginning. During my years working investigations, I learned something that stayed with me long after I left the bureau. Confidence can influence a room, but facts are what survive after the conversation ends. The person who speaks the loudest is not always the person with the strongest position. Sometimes the person who waits quietly, asks questions, and verifies information understands the situation better than everyone else. After the meeting ended, residents stayed behind instead of leaving immediately. They gathered around the documents Clara had reviewed. They looked at the maps. They asked about the timeline. They wanted to understand how a discussion from years earlier had become a plan that involved their entire community. The conversation had completely changed. At the beginning, people were asking how the HOA could move forward with the access plan. Now they were asking how the plan moved forward before anyone confirmed whether the HOA had the right to pursue it. That was the difference between believing a story and understanding the facts. Daniel Mercer waited near the entrance while the clubhouse slowly emptied. "Ethan," he said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him. For what? He glanced back toward the meeting room. For assuming everything had already been verified. I believed Victoria had confirmed the details before presenting the plan. I nodded. A lot of people believed the same thing. Daniel looked at the documents on the table. I should have asked more questions. Most people do not question something when it sounds reasonable, I said. They start questioning when they notice something does not add up. He thought about that for a moment. What happens now? I gathered my papers and placed them back into the folder. Now everyone reviews the same information. That was all I wanted from the beginning. Not a victory speech. Not a public argument. Not to prove I was smarter than anyone else. I wanted the situation handled correctly. Over the next several days, Clara and I organized every document into a complete timeline. Each piece had a place. The original development plans. The old access discussions. The contractor conversations. The HOA notices. The statements made during meetings. When everything was placed together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Victoria had not discovered an existing property right. She had followed an assumption until she believed it had become reality. The difference seemed small at first, but small differences are often where major problems begin. A week later, the HOA board scheduled a formal review meeting. This time, Victoria was not standing at the front of the room explaining a future project. She was sitting at the table answering questions about decisions that had already been made. The change was noticeable. The person who once spoke with complete certainty now had to explain why certain steps happened before approval existed. One board member looked through the records and asked, "Victoria, when did the HOA receive written permission from Mr. Caldwell to move forward with these plans?" The room became quiet. Victoria looked down at the documents in front of her. For the first time, she did not have an immediate answer. "We believed we were working toward an agreement," she finally said. Nobody interrupted, but everyone understood what that meant. Believing something might happen is not the same as having permission to act as if it already happened. Another board member asked about the contractor discussions. Why were outside parties contacted before the property owner agreed? Victoria looked through her notes. We were exploring possibilities. It was the same phrase she had used before. Exploring possibilities. But now the words sounded different. They no longer sounded like progress. They sounded like uncertainty. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The questions themselves revealed the problems. The HOA hired an independent property consultant to review the records. A few days later, the results confirmed what the documents had already shown. Cedar Ridge Farm was separate from Silver Pines Estates. The private road remained private. The proposed access route had never become an approved connection. Nothing had changed. The facts had simply been recognized. Daniel called me after the review was complete. The board is changing how these decisions are handled, he said. No more moving forward without verification. I looked across the fields from my porch. That is probably the right lesson. There was a pause before he asked, Do you think Victoria understands now? I looked toward the old barn my father built. I thought about the first morning she arrived at my gate believing she already knew the answer. I think she does, I said. Sometimes people understand the truth only after the truth becomes impossible to ignore. When Victoria first came to Cedar Ridge Farm, she believed she was dealing with someone who simply needed convincing. She never considered that the quiet person behind the fence was someone who knew exactly which questions needed to be asked. And that was the mistake that changed everything. After the formal review meeting, I expected things to finally slow down. In many ways, they did. The confident announcements stopped. The contractor discussions stopped. The plans that once moved forward as if approval was guaranteed were now being questioned before anyone took another step. But I knew something important. Documents can prove the facts. They cannot immediately change what people believe. Victoria Whitmore had spent months building support for her idea. She had presented herself as someone guiding the community toward progress, accepting that the foundation of her plan was not what she believed would take time. The final HOA review meeting was scheduled 2 weeks later. This time, the purpose was different. It was not about presenting a future project. It was about reviewing how that project reached a point where so many people believed it was already possible. When I arrived at the Silver Pines Clubhouse, the atmosphere was completely different from the first meetings. There were no large maps displayed on screens. No presentation about future improvements. No confident statements about what the neighborhood needed next. Instead, there were folders on the tables and copies of documents prepared for everyone to review. For the first time, the conversation started with evidence instead of expectations. I sat near the back of the room with Clara Bennett beside me. I did not need to lead the discussion. I did not need to convince anyone. The timeline already explained what happened. The first visit to my gate, the inspection request, the notices, the contractor conversations, the old planning documents. Each step showed how a possibility slowly became something people treated as a certainty. Daniel Mercer was the first board member to speak. I think we need to be honest about what happened here, he said. We treated a possibility like it was already guaranteed. Nobody argued. Because that sentence explained the situation better than any long explanation could. A resident near the front raised her hand. I have a question for Victoria. Victoria looked up. Yes. The resident looked down at the documents in front of her. When you first presented this access plan to the community, did you already have written approval from Mr. Caldwell? The room became quiet. Victoria looked at the papers in front of her. For the first time, she did not immediately have an answer ready. No, she finally said. We were working toward an agreement. That answer was simple, but it changed the way people understood everything that came before it. Another resident leaned forward. But the HOA discussed contractors and showed plans before that agreement existed, correct? Victoria looked around the room. Then she slowly nodded. Yes. Nobody reacted dramatically. Nobody needed to. The facts were enough. The residents were not upset because someone had an idea. Ideas were not the problem. The problem was that the HOA moved forward with something that depended on another person's approval before receiving that approval. Clara then explained the legal side of the situation. She spoke calmly and clearly. She explained the difference between a proposal and an actual property right. She explained that Silver Pines could discuss future possibilities, but discussions alone did not create access. They did not change ownership. They did not give the HOA authority over Cedar Ridge Farm. As Clara spoke, I watched the room. The same people who once listened to Victoria explain the plan were now asking different questions. They were no longer asking how the project could happen. They were asking why everyone believed it could happen before verifying the facts. That was the moment everything truly changed. The issue was no longer about my farm. It was about responsibility. After the meeting ended, Daniel walked over to me. "I think everyone understands now," he said. I looked around the clubhouse. Residents were still talking in small groups. They were discussing the process, the decisions, and what could be done differently in the future. Understanding usually comes after people slow down enough to ask the right questions, I replied. Daniel smiled slightly. "You really were paying attention the entire time, weren't you?" I nodded. That was all I was doing. He laughed quietly. Nothing more. Nothing more. Because the truth was, I never wanted this to become a battle. I never wanted Victoria embarrassed. I never wanted the community divided. I wanted the situation handled correctly. That was all. On my way out of the clubhouse that evening, I passed Victoria near the entrance. She was standing alone, holding the same folder she had carried from the beginning. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she looked at me. I should have approached this differently. It was the first time I heard her acknowledge that. I nodded. Most problems can be avoided when people ask before they assume. She looked down at the folder in her hands. "I thought I was helping the community." "I believe you did," I said. "But good intentions still need good decisions." She nodded quietly. That was the first moment I felt the situation was truly changing. Not because Victoria lost. Not because I proved I was right. But because everyone finally understood the same thing. A title can create responsibility. It cannot create authority over something that was never yours. And the person Victoria thought she could pressure was the one person who had been watching every detail from the beginning. After the final review meeting, I expected things to become quiet. In some ways, they did. The meetings became calmer. The conversations became more careful. The plans that once moved forward without clear answers were replaced with questions that should have been asked from the beginning. But there was still one important thing that needed to happen. Silver Pines Estates needed to understand that this was not only about one mistake made by one person. It was about what happens when a group of people move forward based on confidence instead of confirmation. A few weeks later, the new HOA board contacted me and asked if they could visit Cedar Ridge Farm. At first, I was surprised. After everything that happened, I expected them to keep their distance. Instead, they arrived on a Saturday morning without folders full of notices, without contractors, and without a presentation prepared. They came simply to talk. Daniel Mercer was the first person through the gate. He looked around at the fields and smiled slightly. "It feels different being invited in instead of assuming we belong here," he said. I looked at the gate where Victoria had stood. Months earlier. That difference matters. We walked along the southern edge of the property together. I showed them the road that had become the center of the discussion. I showed them the boundary markers. I showed them the areas mentioned in the old planning documents. Seeing the property in person changed the conversation. On paper, Cedar Ridge Farm was just a shape surrounded by lines. A place where someone could imagine a road, a connection, or a future project. Standing there, they saw something else. They saw the work behind the land. They saw the old barn my father built. They saw the fences that had been repaired year after year. They saw a place that was not waiting for someone else's plan. One of the board members stopped near the barn and looked up at the wooden beams above us. "I think we misunderstood what this property represented," she said. I nodded. Most people do when they only see the boundaries. That was something I had learned over the years. Documents tell you who owns something. They do not always explain why that place matters. After the others left, Daniel stayed behind for a few minutes. He looked across the fields before asking his question. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you never tell Victoria about your FBI background when this started?" I expected that question eventually. I looked toward the farmhouse. "Because it should not have mattered." Daniel thought about that. "But it explains why you handled everything differently." I nodded. "Maybe. But the property records were enough. The law was enough. My previous career was never supposed to be the reason someone respected my rights." Daniel looked toward the fields again. "I think that is what surprised people the most. They expected you to use your background to win." I smiled slightly. The facts were already enough. That was the truth. I never wanted my past to become the center of the story. The important thing was never that I had worked for the FBI. The important thing was that the property records were clear before anyone arrived at my gate. Over the following months, Silver Pines changed the way it handled decisions involving neighboring properties. The board required more documentation. Future discussions needed verification before becoming plans. Residents became more involved in meetings. People started asking questions earlier instead of after decisions were already made. No one wanted to repeat what happened with Cedar Ridge Farm. As for Victoria, her role in the community changed. She remained part of Silver Pines, but things were different. People still recognized the work she had done before this situation. But trust had to be rebuilt. That was something no title could restore immediately. One evening, I stood outside the old barn watching the sunset move across the fields. The same place that had caused so much discussion looked completely unchanged. The road was still quiet. The fences were still where they belonged. The farm was still home. I thought about the first morning Victoria arrived. She came through my gate believing she was bringing a solution. She saw land that could serve a purpose. She saw access. She saw opportunity. What she did not see was the history behind that land. She did not see my father building that barn. She did not see the years of work behind every fence post. She did not see that protecting my property was not about refusing progress. It was about respecting ownership. Victoria came to Cedar Ridge Farm believing authority came from having a position. She left understanding something much simpler. Authority comes from respecting the truth before making decisions that affect others. And sometimes the biggest lesson is not proving someone wrong. Sometimes it is showing them why they were wrong in the first place. Months had passed since Victoria Whitmore first walked through my farm gate carrying a folder full of plans and assumptions. Life at Cedar Ridge Farm eventually returned to the rhythm it had always known. The mornings started with coffee on the porch. The fields changed with the seasons. The old barn my father built continued to stand against the Montana sky. The gravel road remained quiet. The fence lines remained exactly where they belonged. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. And in many ways, that was true. The farm was still mine. The property. Records were still clear. The boundaries were still the same. But beyond the fence line, something had changed. People had learned to slow down before making decisions. They had learned that confidence was not the same thing as correctness. Silver Pines Estates continued as a community, but the way decisions were made became different. The HOA began reviewing documents before making plans. Residents became more involved in meetings. Board members started asking questions before assuming they already had the answers. Daniel Mercer called me one afternoon while I was repairing a section of fence near the western field. "Ethan," he said, "I wanted you to know the board finished reviewing everything." I leaned against the fence post and looked across the property. And what did they decide? They agreed the process should have been handled differently. I nodded. That was the answer I expected. Some people feel embarrassed, Daniel continued. They think they should have questioned things sooner. I looked toward the old barn in the distance. Most people do not question something until they realize something does not make sense. There was a pause on the phone. "Do you think Victoria understands now?" I thought about that question for a moment. I thought about the first morning she arrived at my gate. The confidence in her voice. The certainty in her steps. The belief that a position could move things forward before the facts were confirmed. "I think she understands now," I said. It just took longer than it should have. After the call ended, I continued working. The sun was getting lower, and the quiet of the farm returned. It was strange thinking about how much had happened without anything physical changing. The barn was still standing. The fields were still growing. The road was still the same road my family had maintained for decades. The only thing that changed was how people saw the situation. Looking back, the most important moment was not the HOA meeting. It was not the documents spread across the table. It was the first few minutes when Victoria stood outside my gate. She looked at Cedar Ridge Farm and saw a solution waiting to happen. She saw access. She saw opportunity. She saw a future plan. But she never stopped to ask what the property meant to the person standing in front of her. She saw boundaries on a map. I saw my father's work. She saw land. I saw memories. She saw a project. I saw home. That was the difference. Victoria did not lose because I was more powerful than her. She did not lose because I had a title from my past. She lost because the facts did not support the story she believed. The documents were clear. The ownership was clear. The permission she assumed existed was never there. A few weeks later, I received one final letter from the HOA board. This time, it was different from every other letter that had arrived before. It was not a notice. It was not a request. It was an acknowledgement. The board admitted that previous communication had created confusion and that the HOA should have verified its authority before moving forward. I read the letter carefully and placed it with the rest of the records. Not because I needed another piece of proof. I already knew the truth. I kept it because it represented something more valuable. A correction. A reminder that even people with good intentions can make serious mistakes when they stop checking the foundation beneath their decisions. Years later, I still think about that morning when Victoria walked through my gate. She arrived believing she was inspecting my property. She left understanding that she had been revealing her own assumptions. The gate where she first stood never changed. It was still the same gate, the same fence, the same entrance to Cedar Ridge Farm. But the meaning behind it was different. It was never a gate waiting for someone else to decide what happened beyond it. It was a boundary that deserved respect. And that was the lesson Victoria learned. A title can give someone responsibility. It cannot give them ownership. A plan can create excitement. It cannot create permission. And confidence, no matter how strong it sounds, can never replace the truth.